I just got back from Do Kwon's second pretrial conference in New York City, the Thurgood Marshall Building, where the judge, prosecutors, and Do Kwon's defense team were all there preparing for a trial that did get pushed back slightly. We'll get into the details as to why that was, but before we do, notably different inside the courtroom this time as opposed to the first pretrial conference, the initial hearing in Do Kwon's case. If you haven't watched that video, you can go back and take a look at that one. I'll put a link in the description. But it was very different because back then, Do Kwon had just made his first appearance after being exported to the US. And that was a very different vibe. Seeing him in person was jarring. He was much skinnier than when I had last seen him in Singapore. This time around, a little bit more comfortable as he was shackled in that yellow jumpsuit. He had a white thermal on underneath. Shook both the hands of his attorneys before he sat down, and Judge Engelmayer entered the courtroom. But importantly, this one got pushed back, and we heard from the prosecutors for the first time, I think, in any major crypto case, about what the DOJ has put out just a few days ago, a memo pertaining to President Trump's executive order to ease up on prosecuting criminal cases. The DOJ just shut down their fraud unit tied to cryptocurrencies. So we did hear from the prosecutors about whether or not that has any bearing on this case, which we'll get into in a second. But let's start from the very beginning. Judge Engelmayer sat down and presided over this one, which only lasted about an hour. But we first heard from him kind of laying out what he wanted to get through, which were usual things that you might expect at this point. But then also noted that he wants to change the trial date and teased ahead to that, and said as well that if there were any updates from the prosecution in regards to that DOJ memo, to the idea that maybe some of the charges in here, which pertain to cryptocurrencies, and so there are charges of securities fraud and commodities fraud, kind of loosely tied to what are you going to use and why, how are you going to define what Terra was in this case, and will it change anything? So he wanted to hear from prosecutors about that, and then also wanted to get some more clarity on discovery or any suppression or any different motions that either the defense or prosecutors wanted to file. But let's start with the first one, which was around that discovery. And from the first trial hearing, prosecutors had mentioned that they had 4 phones that were confiscated when Do Kwon was extradited from Montenegro. And the update there is that, surprisingly, the government still hasn't really been able to crack into those phones. They had mentioned that their discovery was very limited in substance. Interestingly, the government had mentioned that usually there are algorithms that are run to crack into those phones. You watching this might know more about that than I would, but I did think it was kind of ironic that in a case mostly about algorithmic stablecoins, the prosecutors were talking about an algorithm to get into Do Kwon's phone, but the main takeaway was that they hadn't really discovered much from those phones, and that there probably wouldn't be too much evidence pertaining to those devices, including in trial, a little bit of a back and forth between what that might look like between the defense and the prosecutors. And interestingly enough, this time around, it was David Patton, who is actually one of the more famous public defenders in New York, now switching sides. He did that about, a few years ago to join the law firm Hecker Fink. That is the firm representing Do Kwon in this case. David Patton really didn't say all that much, but I do think it is just kind of interesting that this is a guy who defended the Boston bomber, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, back in that huge case as a public defender, now sitting right next to Do Kwon after the Terra collapse. Some big high-powered attorneys in this as well. After all of that back and forth, there was also a discussion around kind of pretrial motions. Nothing seriously of note after about 30 minutes or so of back and forth. And I'll try and keep this video only pertaining to the juiciest bits. If you want to know anything else that happens, maybe chime me in the comments. Say, hey, Zach, we want more detail. Because otherwise, I'm just going to whip through the spicy bits. And we did get that 30 minutes into the trial hearing, which is, of course, kind of around some of the issues tying back to the original charges. Now, this is pretty important because, as we've seen in other cases brought by the SEC against crypto companies, judges do really want to know how legally some of these things in crypto are defined, whether it's a commodity or security matters, back to which specific charges prosecutors want to try here. And there are a few different charges sprinkled into why Do Kwon is in handcuffs here in the US, and that pertains to money laundering, it pertains to fraud, more specifically securities fraud, and also commodities fraud. And so the tying in of those things does matter in terms of defining what Luna or UST was, what Bitcoin is, and how the prosecutors want to proceed. The reason I bring that up is because earlier, just a few days ago, you had the DOJ coming out and talking about whether or not there might be more cases like these. Specifically because President Trump, in an executive order, basically made the message that in order for the US to become the crypto capital of the world, you can't go after everybody for cases that are on the fringe. Now, when it comes to Do Kwon's case, I don't think this would necessarily count as a case that is on the fringe, at least in terms of what's alleged in the charges. Of course, that is all very different than what we at Coinage discussed in our main documentary around the failure of an algorithmic stablecoin. It's important to note the failure of the algorithmic stablecoin is not what is necessarily charged here. It's more about what Do Kwon said was happening behind the scenes, when in fact it wasn't, and also what he did to allegedly defraud investors into thinking that those things were indeed happening. Mainly, as we saw in the SEC civil fraud trial case, tied back to what was really going on with Chai and whether or not that Korean payments company was actually using the Terra blockchain, or whether Terra, the company, was really just trying to mirror certain things to make it look like it was using the Terra blockchain. And that's come up in multiple different cases. Again, the SEC, the civil fraud trial against Terra, as well as the New York District Attorney and Attorney General Office going after Mike Novogratz from Galaxy over very similar matters. And so it's not the first time we're going to hear about that specific component of Terra and Chai. But why it's important is because Judge Engelmayer asked specifically, are there any kind of issues or updates as to whether or not that DOJ memo, which basically said, hey, we need to look into ending the criminal prosecution of crypto cases, and saying, will that have any sort of bearing on this case? And the prosecution said, we're aware of that memo, but went on to say, we have no plans to change our charges at this time. Now, it doesn't necessarily rule out that those charges could change before we get to the beginning of the trial, which is kind of interesting. But at the very least, we did hear prosecutors echo that this case does involve Bitcoin, which is largely held by now in the US to be considered a commodity. And so kind of the involvement of Bitcoin in the way that it was used through Luna Foundation Guard, that entity that was spun up and run by Do Kwon ostensibly to back the peg, would involve commodities fraud in that sense, and nothing really about the DOJ memo changes kind of anything established around that. And again, I don't think anything necessarily would change in the memo itself and how it's being used or applied, as Judge Engelmayer asked in this case. So we at least got that update from prosecutors saying that they're aware of the memo, but it's not going to change anything, as well as, I know that this is kind of an open question around what are digital assets. Judge Engelmayer asked that as well. What, if any, digital assets might be tied to what charges are brought here? And you heard prosecutors basically say nothing's really changed. And so, pretty interesting update because Judge Engelmayer is going through all this and trying to be protective, by the way, of the court's time. I don't think anyone in this case necessarily wants to do this whole back and forth only to see the trial kind of get canceled for one reason or the other, especially not Judge Engelmayer, which, by the way, brings us to the point of why he wanted to postpone the trial date. I've already seen, even though it's only been a few hours since this all just played out in court, I've already seen some fake news around why the trial got pushed back. And to be very clear, Judge Engelmayer basically came out and said, hey, look, I'm sorry, I forgot. I accidentally did have something planned for February, which would be around kind of the January start date for this trial. And so he said, would anyone be opposed to moving this back slightly to February 17th to start then? And neither the defense nor prosecutors had any issue with that. And so we have a new trial start date of February 17th, at least for now. So we'll see what happens there. But I think that is also important because you gather that the defense is in no rush to have this case sprint into trial, given not just that, we're aware of this DOJ memo that essentially is saying, hey, if you don't need to, don't prosecute these criminal cases. But also we've seen some pretty big pardons from President Trump over the last few weeks. And so there is a bit of a tone shift in terms of how his administration is thinking about these things. He's already pardoned, by the way, people who have been convicted of fraud, including Nikola founder, EV founder, Trevor Milton, who already went through all this stuff and was convicted and nonetheless was pardoned. And so you kind of think about, as there was a lot of press, Korean press at this trial, at this conference, I should say, and there were questions of like, hey, how do you think this will change? Are you actively, one Korean reporter tried to run up to Do and ask him if he is pursuing a pardon from Trump, which you got to assume behind the scenes that his team is. The marshals essentially pushed him away, and Do, kind of this time around looked away from everybody as he went to the elevator and went back, assumingly, to go back to prison. But I think this is interesting because, it might not seem like a lot, but an extra month to potentially get this all squared away before going to trial is pretty important. And I had this weird feeling when you're in the courtroom that it seems like one of those things that at the time might not matter. Who cares if the trial starts in January or February? But that could loom large just in terms of more time to potentially pursue other options before the trial begins. But nonetheless, February 17th, the next date, or the new date for the trial to begin. Outside of that, the rest of it was just kind of back and forth around pretrial motions, expert witnesses, getting those squared away, whether or not there were other prosecutors from around the world working on this case too, which we are aware, and I found out after I got out of the courthouse, there were Korean nationals in there tied back to the government and prosecutors, I think, in this case that were present looking at some of the facts here too. And so interesting to see the Korean government also out here this time. I presume they were there last time, but they were there, had a nice chat with them as well. And so a lot of interest. There were also German students, law students, taking up a whole half side of the courtroom. So kind of busier than the last time, a little bit less drama, but in general, the path is clear for this one to still continue. Per usual, the next pretrial conference scheduled for June 12th at 11 a.m. And so in general, steady as she goes in terms of this case. Still more time now for Do Kwon's defense to potentially pursue other paths, and not too much. I think there is a healthy window here for people to speculate whether or not that memo also, at the same time, might start to impact this case. There are only two prosecutors, which I think for a second pretrial conference, not necessarily expectant that the government would have a lot more than that there, but still kind of notably less attended than the SBF trials that we also covered. Perhaps I'll put the description or a link to those in the description as well. But overall, we have our time marker set, and clearly, as was communicated by the judge, questions to protect everybody's time on whether or not this case will continue, given some of the changes the administration has around crypto and this collapse. Again, the collapse is not what's charged, and why the collapse actually happened is not what's charged. It's more so what was communicated and conducted in the run-up to the collapse, which is always an important thing to communicate on this. As always, leave your thoughts in the comments, because as we continue covering this case leading into trial, I think it's very interesting to hear from the crypto community. As a community-owned show, we want to bring those views into our coverage as well. If you're watching this and you're already a Coinage subscriber NFT holder, I'm not going to bother you about it. But if you aren't, you can mint one of those at coinage.media to join our community, as well as, importantly, co-own Coinage with me and everyone else in the community, which I think is something that we're doing, kind of pioneering a new route to tokenize a show as a US registered cooperative. And if you haven't yet, check it out at coinage.media to become a member today. But as usual, we'll be following all the updates. You can get all the headlines at coinage.media on not just this case, but everything big happening in crypto. I'm Zach Guzman. If you haven't yet, click the like button, subscribe, and we'll see you again soon.